Love getting to speak about this topic in particular of all the things that I've written. I love talking about Southern history, obviously, researching it, writing it. But this is a topic that most people don't know that much about. So it's always new, it's always a discovery. And it's really intriguing to me personally, is how I got into it, because it's a story of our connection, the Gulf Coast, meaning our connection to America's founding era. And a lot of people either have forgotten or were confused about the fact that we were a colony. There was a British colony Alabama was part of, and there were more than 13 colonies. And ours was just not one of those that joined that effort of rebellion for some reasons we'll get into today. So that's what the book is about. Call it 14th Colony, because it helps us understand there's more to the story than the 13 colonies you've heard about. And the book is essentially a narrative history of this colony. And we'll talk about today when it was created and why, where its borders were, who was here, what they were doing, and ultimately how it all got involved with the Revolutionary War and how that changed the ownership of the colony. So we'll move pretty quickly, give you just the overviews of these basic points about the colony, try to answer some questions at the end, but certainly we won't have time to get into too many details on each topic, but I hope that at the end of this, you have a better understanding of the Gulf South's colonial heritage and understand where this fits in with all the various eras that we have. So before I get into it, I'm assuming everybody can see the screen. Everything's good. All right. So that's the cover of the book. Let me start. Why was there a colony called British West Florida? And we won't dwell on the backstory, but the backstory of that is that there was an international war between France and Great Britain called the 7 Years' War. France lost the war, and Great Britain, as a consequence, gained an enormous amount of territory. There's a map here I've got on the screen that shows the territorial claims in North America between France, Great Britain, and Spain before and after the war. And so you see on the left, you see that France is a major player in the continent as far as colonial claims go. And you'll see on the right, you'll see that color for France, that orange peach color, is completely gone. And that's because France was forced to cede those homes.
We're not seeing that slide.
Okay. Are you seeing any slide?
The cover of the book.
Okay.
So you need to go.
How about now?
No.
No.
Still the cover.
Okay. Let me try one other thing here.
Yeah, it's not advancing the slides.
It's advancing for me, but maybe not for y'all. We got to figure out why.
We can see it on the left side there down below it, but it's not going to that one. There it is. Yeah.
Now do you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, now let's see. Does it advance now?
Yes.
Which side? Okay, well then, okay, we fixed it maybe. All right, so back to the map that I was showing, before and after the war. Left is before, right is after, and you see that France is gone. And this all occurred over the course of, 1754 is when the war started. 1763 is when the treaty negotiating the war ended. So you've got a huge land swap that takes place in North America in 1763, and there's a lot of repercussions about that are relevant to a lot of things in American history, but we're not going to get into that today. We're going to talk about the one thing that comes out of this that directly impacts our topic today, and that's the fact that Great Britain gained an enormous amount of territory. Spain gained some, lost some. France is gone. And what Great Britain did is they decided in the very southern reaches of the colony, of this new territory they gained, to create not one, but two new colonies that most people have forgotten about in American history. That's East and West Florida. So we're going to focus on West Florida, but East Florida is essentially the Florida Peninsula. And you can see that on the right. West Florida is what we're going to talk about, and this was its original borders, and those borders will be changed, but its original borders were Mississippi River on the west, Apalachicola River on the east, Gulf on the south, the 31st parallel on the north, which is of course, you probably recognize is still a portion of the border between Alabama and Florida today. And of course, there's a portion of Mississippi and Louisiana where that border is still intact. So that's where that dates back to, all the way to this creation of this colony. And Mobile Bay, where I'm sitting today, is sort of dead center in this colonial entity, created in 1763. The very next year, however, when British officials arrived on the scene to take over the land from the French and the Spanish who had been here prior, they petitioned to move the border north. And they knew there were no other competing European claims in the area. They knew all those rivers that drain into the Gulf go through this area, and it just made sense to try to incorporate more of that rather than trying to be strictly a coastal entity. And they petitioned to move the border fairly far north, up as far as basically where Tennessee is, the Tennessee state line. And they were not allowed to do that, but they did allow the colony's northern border to be moved north up to the 32nd parallel, 28 minutes, which sounds a little bit arbitrary, but it is where the Mississippi River, where the Yazoo River empties into the Mississippi. So it's modern day Vicksburg, bluffs of Vicksburg. If you're on the Mississippi River, easy spot to find. And if you drew a line across, from west to east, from that point to the Chattahoochee River, you would go through Jackson, Mississippi, Montgomery, Alabama, onto Columbus, Georgia. So that's how far north this went. As you can see on the map, that ultimately would include portions of Louisiana and Florida and half of Mississippi and Alabama. So the story of West Florida is a pretty big story that extends far beyond the state of Florida. And some people get that confused. But so this is a regional colonial heritage that we're talking about here. Now, the first people that arrived on the scene, the British, they were taking over an area which had been administered at different times by the French and the Spanish. And at the time they took over, the Spanish had been previously in Pensacola. They left it. And then the French had been in Mobile. Mobile had been the capital of French Louisiana. So they're taking over an area that had some colonial heritage dating back decades. And on the maps, if you looked at the maps in 1760, you might have assumed that there's a pretty robust series of communities on the coast. And in truth, wasn't quite as robust as it might have appeared. Mobile, Pensacola, each were basically small villages of 200 people, 300 people at most. So that basically all life revolved around the military outpost. And when they pulled up and left, you did not have a big functioning, thriving place they were taking over. The British got on the ground and realized they were going to have to build the colony almost from scratch, even though it had existed for a while in some way, shape, or form. And all that is complicated by the fact that they're arriving in an area that they're not acclimated to. The Gulf Coast can be a little bit inhospitable to newcomers in this time period. You've got diseases like yellow fever that they have no cure for. You've got hurricanes. You've got heat and humidity that they're not accustomed to. And when they first got there, within a few months, in Mobile especially, over half of the garrison that was sent to take over the place in a few months was either dead or in the sick ward. So it was a rough start to it, and there were a lot of negative ideas like that. They perceived themselves to be about as far away from civilization as you can imagine at the time. We think of the Gulf Coast completely differently today, but at the time, this was far, far removed from the center of British activities in North America that we all know about on the East Coast. So they thought of themselves being completely stranded in this no man's land that's unhealthy, inhospitable, and would be very difficult to create. And so a lot of people at first wondered, is this thing going to fly? Is all this effort going to be worth it? And to their credit, the British, despite all the negative first impressions of this effort, they launched into it with an abandon, and they really did put serious resources and serious effort into trying to create a colony. and they created a government for it. This is the seal of the government of West Florida. It was the first representative government of the sort that existed in the Gulf Coast. You had an appointed governor, an appointed council, which advised him. But when the governor called the legislature into session, you would elect members to a lower house from the various communities that existed. And then the upper council, the council of advisors, would become the upper house. So you had a bicameral legislature, but it only met when the governor called it. And he only called it into session 7 times during the colony's existence. The capital was at Pensacola from the start, stayed there, primary port, and also the primary seat of government for the colony through the whole existence of British West Florida. And I like to remind people here in the presentations I give that you will learn a few reasons we don't know much about West Florida. And I think that one of the primary ones is the fact that the colony only existed for 18 years. We'll talk about how it all ended rather abruptly. But think about all the other colonies you know about in the story of America's establishment, you know, all the East Coast colonies. The youngest of them at the time of the American Revolution was Georgia, which was 50 years old, 40 years old. So you're talking about a colony that from its very beginning till it got caught up in the Revolutionary War was very much brand new and on the make and being developed. Had it had a century or more to develop, as some of the other colonies we're familiar with did, things might have been a lot different. But the fact that it wasn't developed was not through a lack of trying. It was working to get there. It just took time, and they only had about a decade and a half to make all this happen. So it went through a series of governors, appointed governors. I'm not going to go through all the political history of the colony, except to say the first governor, George Johnstone, sort of laid the groundwork for what all the other colonies, the other governors would follow. And that's essentially, trying to do some obvious things that are more easily said than done. That's improving roads, finding crops that people can make money on, encouraging them to come and live in the colony, improving defenses, all these sort of things. His downfall was that he couldn't get along with anybody. He was just a cantankerous, self-righteous sort of guy, and it was always his way or the highway, and no one could work with him very long. And the governor in London recalled him, sent a series of other appointed governors there, went through some tumultuous times. One of the governors committed suicide a month after he got there. Another one shot somebody in a duel, and they thought they were going to have their sitting governor on trial for murder. It was just a little bit of a difficult political situation until Peter Chester arrives, and Chester is never universally popular, but he does get everybody on the same page to the degree they ever were. And you can see by the years on the screen, he served over half of the years of the colony's existence as the governor of the colony. So he did sort of calm the political waters, enabled them to focus on the real effort of building a colony. And one of the key parts of building a colony in this area had to do with how to get along with the Native Americans who, in this region, overwhelmingly outnumbered the colonists several times over. At any given point, West Florida probably had a population of Europeans and African slaves, anywhere between 3,000 to 5,000 people. It's not a huge population. At the same time, the Native Americans throughout the area in what is now Alabama, Mississippi, and those regions would have had populations easily numbering 30 to 50,000. So had they not wanted a new British colony on their back door, they could have done something about it. They didn't. Complex set of reasons that require a whole lot of other discussions. But the one primary reason that didn't happen is that both sides were benefiting enormously through trade. Trade was the glue that helped all these relationships, help them keep them together. The British brought manufactured items that the Native Americans very much wanted, made their lives better. They had guns, tools, axes, pots, pans, cloth, spices. The Native Americans were bringing to the British to trade for this hundreds of thousands of deer skins that were being shipped out of colonial ports every year. This is like industrial scale gathering of deer skins. And they're doing all this with these European weapons. These are not guys out hunting with a bow and arrow. And so this trade worked probably better for both sides at this particular point than it had any time prior, and certainly after. It continued. It was lived longer than just the colony of West Florida, but West Florida was established right when this was at its height, and deer skins were in the most demand in Europe as a form of sort of cheap leather. They made them into leggings, book bindings, hats, gloves, all kinds of things, and it was very much in demand for that moment. Now, the Europeans and the few that are bringing African slaves or buying them from the colony of Louisiana to the west, Spanish colony, they are doing everything that you probably assume they might be doing, even if you didn't know a lot about the time period. They're trying to earn a living by farming the land, finding a crop that makes money. So they grow subsistence crops for food, corn and chickpeas and rice. They herd cattle and hogs. They try tobacco as a crop to make some cash on, which is very lucrative, but more and better tobacco was being grown elsewhere in the British colonies. They tried their hand at indigo, which was very lucrative when you had the right connections, but it's a very complicated process to transform this indigo plant into this powder that can be used as a blue dye, and required a lot of connections internationally to market it. And remember, West Florida is a brand new colony, doesn't really have those established networks. So most people were trying to figure that out before, and by the time the colony ended, they never did get all that together. Most people, their day-to-day life is subsistence crops, a few other things, and then taking advantage of the timber resources that are in the area as a mainstay of helping pay the bills. The lumber that's available, readily available in the area was just enormous, and they could use it for everything from, building to barrel staves to ship things overseas, to the pitch and tar that you can get from pine that they use to caulk up the seams of ships. So the naval stores industry was a big part of the economy, British West Florida. And you can see by this map of the Mobile-Tensile Delta that was beginning to happen, because what you see on there, all those rectangles, are land concessions where settlers were either living or paying or had slaves clearing out part of their concessions. And so gradually you had this agricultural economy beginning to take shape, but it would take decades to make it as vibrant an agricultural colony as some of the other American colonies, but it was in the process. And they very quickly discovered some of the best land for that was not in Mobile and Pensacola regions. It's actually on the Mississippi River. So the Natchez area really started to grow in the 1770s, and they called it the most charming prospect in the world. Governor Mumford Brown said, if you could not make a living off the land there, you probably couldn't do it anywhere on the continent. And so the colony is growing, and it's becoming sort of a farming colony, and rather than a concentrated urban center. This home that stands in Pascagoula today, the Krebs House, dates to the 1770s. It's a really good example of the type of architecture that the wealthy planners of West Florida, not many, but the wealthiest of the wealthy would have lived in. This is obviously the era before the white columned, Greek revival planter mansions. This is before that. This is a wealthy man's home. This is probably your average settler's home. And I always like to make the joke here, because this just gives me a perfect opportunity. But this is a home that was on Dauphin Island, which the French had first called Massacre Island, and the name sort of stuck. And so this is a far-flung colony trying its best to encourage settlement. And the one image I've ever been able to find of an average settler homestead is this, and it says a view of a cottage on Massacre Island, which is not exactly Chamber of Commerce material for a struggling new colony. But anyway, that sort of gives you some idea of the situation. Now, as I mentioned, people are trying to make a go of it, and the government's not sitting by doing nothing. They're investing in West Florida. The best understanding of what they were doing is probably illustrated by what they attempted to do. They were not successful, but what they attempted to do on the colony's western border, where the Iberville River, which is really a wet ditch most of the year, enters into the Mississippi River. This is roughly where Baton Rouge is. They had the notion that rather than allowing the Mississippi River to flow through the foreign-held port of New Orleans, held by Spain at the time, Louisiana is a Spanish colony, they would divert the water of the Mississippi so that it entered and emptied into West Florida. And they thought they could do this by creating a man-made ditch using shovels and picks to create a canal that would divert the waters of the Mississippi from the Iberville into the Emmet, into Lake Maurepas, into Lake Pontchartrain, into the Gulf. It sounds convoluted and complex, and it was. It didn't work, but it didn't stop them from trying, sinking a lot of money and effort into it, and actually planning and selling lots for towns that would be on this new international waterway. So you can see from this story alone, they had plans for the colony. It was not allowed just to sit and languish and do nothing. And who knows what would have happened if it had 50 years before war intervened. But as it was, the population was growing. The place was starting to show some signs of life. Population more than doubled in its first decade, but 5,500 people over an area the size that we're talking about, it's not growing by leaps and bounds. And then all of a sudden, everything is thrown into disorder by the American Revolution, this war that springs up on the East Coast. And ultimately, despite their best efforts, is going to ultimately find its way to impact West Florida. You don't have to know much about geography. You may not be able to pinpoint exactly where Valley Forge was on a map, but in general, that when we're thinking about the Gulf Coast, that the American Revolutionary Wars fought primarily north and east of here. You don't think of this area being a primary theater of combat. But it was in a lot of ways. And the interaction, the combat's primarily between two foreign powers, but it affected the outcome of the revolution. Now, the basic question before we get into the campaigns, the military campaigns that affected the Gulf Coast and would ultimately end the colony's days as a part of the British Empire, the basic question a lot of people have is, well it's a colony. We know there were 13 colonies. Why did it not join the other colonies? It was invited to more than once, invited to participate in this rebellion. But the reasons that they politely declined really aren't simply answered. It's 100% not because they were all just strong loyalists. The reason is really that you got to put yourself in their situation, 1770s, new colony, relying extraordinarily on the blessings of the government. The population is inordinately composed of people in the direct employ of the government. No newspapers being published. Very rarely are you having regular communication with other British colonies, certainly not on a regular basis. You hear bits and pieces that there's some uproar going on in Massachusetts or South Carolina. How's that got to do anything with your daily life? And so that they perceived it at first as purely somebody else's problem, sort of a local concern that didn't really involve them and didn't really want to become involved in this and didn't see how throwing themselves in with that cause would help them because they weren't that really closely affiliated with the other British colonies to begin with. So they politely declined. And there was some discussion in the colony about things like the Stamp Act. There was some grumbling, but there was never an effort to really take a stand either way for the most part, even when the colony was genuinely threatened by attack from Spain during the war. We'll discuss that. The British government found that the locals really weren't rushing to arms to defend it. They weren't rushing to arms to do anything. They just wanted to find a way how to make a living day to day, which was hard enough on the frontier. And they wanted to shy away from these sort of allegiances. And I'm overgeneralizing what happened. There were certainly a few people on the extremes, but this is not the same story that played out in North Carolina and Connecticut. I mean, this is a different place, a different time. Despite all of that attempt at neutrality, the British government was very happy to have any part of its North American empire that was not in open rebellion. So they looked at the situation and they declared West Florida to be a safe haven for people who were persecuted, who would declare their loyalty. And so you did have some people that came into the colony specifically because they were persecuted elsewhere for their loyal sympathies who came to the colony. But some of those people, you can't read too much into that either. Some of those people were taking advantage of a rather low threshold for proving persecution to take advantage of some generous land grants and basically get out of the way of the fighting. So whether or not their loyalties were real strong, it was very attractive to take free land and a new place that was not in war. And so a lot of people moved in for that. So there are two military campaigns that affect the colony, and that's where we will end, with the colony's days ending as a result of one of them. One involved combat between France and Spain and Great Britain, and the other involved the only really direct interaction of British forces in this area and American forces. And it's really a raid, and it's important. It's not necessarily military, but what it alerted the British officials on the ground to, and that's Willing's raid. Got underway in 1778. Willing was a guy who had formerly lived in Natchez. He knew that people in the Continental Congress were interested in, if they won this war and found a new nation, they looked at the map and said, well, we would love to have those ports down there on the Gulf and the rivers that empty there. But West Florida doesn't really want to join this thing, and nobody had the wherewithal to try to open up a new campaign in the war. So Willing volunteered himself. He said, look, I'll go down there. I know the territory. If you'll just give me a commission in the Continental Navy and just give me 50 guys in a ship, I'll go down there and I'll make sure they stay out of the war, so that once this is all settled, we can negotiate. And he said, I'll also make sure that the Mississippi and Ohio rivers stay open for the Spanish in New Orleans, who hate the British, for the Spanish to send George Washington's army money and supplies. The complications and all that was that West Florida was not going to join the war. So his interference wasn't needed. And probably the second largest financier of the American Revolution lived in New Orleans, a guy named Oliver Pollock. They were sending hundreds of thousands of dollars to George Washington already without him doing anything on the rivers, and sending him ammunition and arms. So all that was happening. So what Willing ultimately did was a raid. He stepped ashore at Natchez. He planted an American flag. He said, stay out of the war, you'll be fine. Stays all, you're neutral. Then he got back on his boat and he proceeded to go down the river and rob plantations at will. And he knew he could do this because he knew once he got to New Orleans, which was a Spanish-held colony, that he would probably be allowed to sell whatever he captured, make a lot of money, and go back. And that's exactly what he attempted to do. Now, the complicating factor in all this is that Spain and Great Britain were obviously different under different administrations, and they're not officially, they never were allied with each other, and they were not supposed to be trading with each other. But look at the situation where they're at. The most obvious trading partners each had was each other, and so there's a great deal of clandestine trade had been going on throughout West Florida's period as part of the British Empire. And Louisiana sort of looked the other way. British officials looked the other way, to the point that some of the British boats and traders were actually operating in New Orleans, not just traveling the river, but keeping shops, because it worked for each other. But as this war started developing, Great Britain became involved in this little upstart rebellion. The Spanish government saw some opportunities to reclaim some land they lost from a distracted rival, to hurt Great Britain. When they were sort of fighting for their lives, the empire's life there in North America, and they weren't going to sit there and just allow that to go uncapitalized on. So previous to Willing's raid, there had been this sort of friendly wink and a nod relationship between the two colonies. But once Willing's raid occurred, and the British said, "You're harboring a guy who just took the property of our citizens and allowing them to sell it. You're protecting him, and you won't turn him over." It made them very aware. They probably should have already been, but very well aware that the Spanish were when the chips were down, that they were going to do what was best in their national interest. And if their home government was considering declaring war on Great Britain, they were going to do whatever was required. And so it made the British aware that, one, their colony wasn't all that well protected, and two, that their neighbors to the west, they had not really perceived as a threat before, they realized that as this thing starts happening, this American Revolution and alliances, foreign alliances are entering into the field. France is allied with the United States. Spain is considering declaring war on Great Britain, that it's going to have some impact at home. And their colony might actually end up being threatened, even though at first they thought, we're just going to watch what happens. But they realized they couldn't sit and watch because they were ultimately going to be caught up in it. And that's exactly what happened. The governor of the Spanish colony of Louisiana knows his home government is being persuaded to join the war in some way by France, which is its ally. They don't want to declare alliance with the United States because they don't want to set this precedent of encouraging rebellion of their own colonies, because they own colonies too. But they do want to harm Great Britain when they're distracted and involved in a war that's taken everything they've got. And the governor of Louisiana knows his home government is considering this. And so rather than waiting for it to happen, he actively plans what he would do the minute he hears there is war, a rupture between the countries, so that he can launch a surprise attack before the British even have an idea of what to do. And that's exactly what he does. Once war is declared, Spain declares war on Great Britain, he immediately launches a campaign out of New Orleans, goes up to the southern border of West Florida there at Fort Butte, captures it, goes up to Baton Rouge, captures it, marches through the swamps with this diverse force, forces the government, the commander at Baton Rouge, to surrender not only his fort, but the fort at Natchez, which is 100 miles up the river. But in this lightning campaign, before the British even had a plan about what to do about Spain entering the war, they've lost half of their territory. And to boot, Galvez, who had led this campaign, is back in New Orleans planning for the second campaign, planning for the next target. The next target is going to be Mobile. And Mobile is significant for several reasons, but its primary significance lies in the fact that once you've captured the western border, if you capture Mobile, which is the next large city of any size to the east, you effectively control 2/3 or more of the entire colony. And the British knew that, and Galvez knew it. So he's got this diverse force. He's already conducted this lightning raid. He's organizing these guys to go attack Mobile. And the British are just getting into gear about what to do and how are we going to combat this, and requesting troops that are elsewhere occupied in North America. So they're at a real disadvantage here. And that's exactly what the Spanish had planned on. And so Galvez launches this effort to take Mobile. He comes into Mobile Bay, drags these huge cannon up through the southern swamps to the south of Mobile. It's a long siege process. Takes a few weeks to get everything in place, but it's a one-day battle. The British had hoped to hold out long enough to have some relief forces from Pensacola come to their aid. But the battle, once they opened up the large cannons on them, they were blowing holes through the walls of the fort big enough that they said a man could walk through by the end of the day. The white flag goes up. The relief column got just close enough to hear some of the final shots, weren't able to participate in it. And it's not a battle that's Gettysburg in terms of casualties, but it's enormously consequential in the amount of, when you refer to the amount of territory that the Spanish had suddenly gained. And at the end of that battle, they effectively controlled 3/4 of the colony. And the only thing left in British possession was Pensacola. And so the Spanish left a small outpost on the eastern shore of Mobile Bay, near where I am today, Spanish Fort, between Spanish Fort and Daphne. And that was sort of a lookout post while Galvez went back to New Orleans, resupplied for this final campaign to take Pensacola. So that small outpost is there as an observation post, watching what the British are doing, making sure they don't plan any offensive action. And the British realized their one best chance to turn the course of the war was to capture that little fortification. And so they actually designed a surprise attack on it. They had about 175 or 80 guys in it, but the British sent ships into Mobile Bay to cut off any potential resupply from the Mobile area. And they launched troops overland from Pensacola, and they descended on this little fortification on the eastern shore of the bay right at dawn on a foggy January morning. and attacked it, and they almost completely overwhelmed it. The Spanish were eventually able to get themselves together good enough to get their 2 pieces of artillery into action, and that overwhelming attack was at length sort of slowed down, and then suddenly, rather than one side just taking over, you had 2 roughly evenly matched forces, one of which is behind walls with artillery. And the British realized their best chance had passed. They were not able to storm it and take it in that surprise attack, and it didn't take them very long to figure out they probably weren't going to take it at all. And so at length, they pull out, go back to Pensacola, everybody knows, which is the final goal of these military campaigns. And as you can see from the screen there, some substantial casualties. Again, not a Civil War battle casualties, but you're talking about 35, 40 guys on either side killed and wounded, which is a pretty big battle by these standards, and certainly the largest Revolutionary War battle that took place in Alabama. So Galvez then, as soon as the British pull back after that attack, he's hot on their heels, and he's bringing his forces from Pensacola. He's got forces meeting him from Cuba. He's got French forces that have a French fleet in the Gulf that will eventually join him, and they're all making their way to Pensacola Bay, where he is going to lay siege to the largest and best series of defenses that the British had anywhere in the colony around the capital. This is a 3-month-long siege where they're getting closer and closer day by day with constant fighting to a series of fortifications. It's not one fort in Pensacola. You can see from this map, which has a modern map of Pensacola, which these historical features are overlaid. It's forces around Pensacola Bay. It's multiple forts that sort of surround the town of Pensacola. And so it's a long, drawn-out siege, and they're getting closer and closer. They get to the point that they're slowing down the ability of the British to even return fire, because they're completely surrounded. And if everybody goes up above the wall to do anything, they're immediately got all these guns pointed at them. So they eventually make it where the British are forced to sit and endure this bombardment. And one of the shells fired on one of the mornings, the last day of the siege, of hundreds of guns being fired, this one shell makes its way into the open door of a powder magazine in one of the British forts. And lots of confusion and smoke. And when everything had settled, they'd lost 75 to 100 guys. They'd lost 2 or 3 of the walls of the fort. And the British realized that there's really nothing left to do but to surrender. They cannot continue to make a resistance. And so they surrendered the town on May 10th, 1781. Galvez had forced, by military might, he had captured every military fortification in West Florida. British West Florida became Spanish West Florida. And if you go to Pensacola Day, you'll see this equestrian statue of Galvez, and around the base of it are descriptions of all these battles that I've just talked about. So when the American Revolution ends, the United States declares its independence. It recognizes that to its south is a new foreign territory. It's not British any longer. It is now Spanish West Florida. The little quibble that they have about that, which will kind of wrap us up here, kind of bring it full circle into how it impacts Alabama history in the long run, is that the Treaty of Paris ending the war specified that the 31st parallel would be the border between the United States and Spanish West Florida. They were referencing the first treaty that established the colony, the 1763 treaty, which, remember, that was the original border. But also remember, the British had moved that border up. And so the Spanish, who had just captured it, said, that's all well and good, but we'd rather keep that border where the British did, because now we control this colony. And the United States didn't like that, and there were a lot of bigger fish to fry, but it sort of simmered for about a decade or 15 years before Americans were finally able to bring Spain to the negotiating table. They agreed to surrender that disputed strip of land that you see hash marked there on the bottom left of the map between the Mississippi and the Chattahoochee River. That's that disputed strip. And the British, the Spanish eventually agreed to pull back below that line down to the 31st parallel. That was in the 1790 5 Treaty of San Lorenzo. Took them 2 years to finally make the withdrawal actually happen. When they eventually got all their forces down below the 31st parallel, the United States immediately annexed that disputed strip of territory and created a new American territory called the Mississippi Territory. And so that is where Alabama and Mississippi date their journeys towards statehood from that time period. And of course, later, what's left of British West Florida, it's now Spanish West Florida, would eventually, over the course of about 2 decades between 1798 and 1819, be chopped up into the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. And so that's again a story for another day, those last years, but that's ultimately what happened to this whole colonial entity and how it's a part of Gulf Coast heritage. So that's a real quick overview of the story of British West Florida. If anybody wants a copy of the book, it's available online. You get it easily. If you happen to want a signed copy or anything, I'll be glad to send you one if you send me an email, but it's easy to find. And I appreciate having an opportunity to share the story with you. Be glad to take any questions that I can.
Do you require specific dates on the test tomorrow? That's a joke.
Yeah, no specific dates. If you know British West Florida existed, you pretty much aced it.
Did any of the part that was left after the things went down to the lower parallel, was that in any way part of the Louisiana Purchase later on or not?
Well, that's an interesting story. The United States claimed it was after the fact. I get asked this question a lot, so let me just tell you the basics of it. The Louisiana Purchase is negotiated in 1803, and the language in the Louisiana Purchase references the fact that it will include all of that territory that was formerly the French colony of Louisiana. You know, the French had taken that back over for just less than a year, and they immediately sold it. So that was the language in the treaty. Well, a little tidbit, the United States wanted they wanted everything down to the Gulf. They wanted to find a way to oust the Spanish and get down to the Gulf, take that all over. And they found that there's because of the language in that treaty, people had forgotten that when there was a colony of French Louisiana, and Mobile was its first capital and eventually moved to New Orleans, the border that was recognized, the de facto border between the French territory and Spanish territory on the Gulf, had been the Perdido River. That's basically the Alabama-Florida border. That was sort of the recognized border between those two colonial entities going back to 1700. And so they sort of seized on that and said, well, yeah, that language indicates all that had been French territory, and that had been French territory. And so they began to say, well, you're forgetting the rest of the coast should be part of the Louisiana Territory, but it was clearly not in the original intention. But the United States ultimately, there were some Americans got tired of paying taxes to the Spanish to ship goods into the Gulf and really began a rebellion and took over the Spanish fort at Baton Rouge in 1810. The United States threatened war, eventually showed up with ships, and the Spanish, who were declining as a world power, ultimately gave the territory under the threat of being attacked during the War of 1812. So the long answer is the United States tried to use that as a claim to take over the territory. Ultimately, a decade later, they didn't need it. They just took it.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Okay.
There's a fort on the west side of Pensacola. It was called Barrancas.
Yeah.
Was this established when the Spanish took over at that time?
Not the one that was there during the Civil War, but there had been a fortification on that site. That was a spot that was guarding approach to Pensacola, and there had been batteries there. Over the years, there had been more than one fortification. And so that was an area that the British had fortified. Now, after the Spanish took over, I think that was the third time they had taken over Pensacola. If I'm not mistaken, they created yet another series of fortifications. That's where the barrancas that stands today, that's associated with the Civil War, that's that iteration of it dates to that time period.
There's only a tiny building left to show that it was even there, but I lived in Barrancas for 2 full years in the about 1935, and I was just disappointed to see it, such a tiny thing remaining there. But the Naval Air Station simply swallowed the whole thing. So
it did, and there were multiple fortifications over the years dating back to 1699, and so there's more than one occupation of the Spanish, but that had been a point for defense for everybody who owned it. Yeah, all the way up to the American period.
I have read your book, and it's wonderful. I really highly recommend it. A lot more detail, a lot of adventure, a lot of history. So it's something everybody should get a copy or access a copy and read. It's wonderful. I also put in the chat, I put a link to information about the historical marker that Mike mentioned at the very beginning of his talk that set the northern boundary. And there's a historical marker for that purpose near York, Alabama, and also one in Smith Station. And the line also went through just south of Wetumpka on Highway 231, crosses that boundary. And so it'd be nice to have a historical marker there on Highway 231. So we would have one on the western side of the state where the latitude is, one on the eastern side, and then that would put one right in the middle of the state. So.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, I think there was one at one time that may have disappeared for some reason. I'm not 100% sure, but it seems like there was one somewhere, near Prattville, Wetumpka area that stood for a long time. Now, have to double check me on that, but it seems like there had been, and I guess it's never been replaced if it was there and it's gone.
Yeah, the state does not list it on their list of historical markers. So.
Yeah, it's not one now. That's for sure. So, yeah, we need one there. Okay. Well, I appreciate it. And I see there's a question in the chat. I'll try to answer that. Was there another question to answer while I'm here? Somebody was asking, was most residents of Pensacola and Mobile, did they speak English? In Mobile, most of the population was French, and they decided to stay and take an oath of allegiance. And then all the newcomers were, of course, speaking English. So there were a lot of French speakers. Matter of fact, the English, when they arrived, they put out the notice that they could make a oath of allegiance to the British. They put it out in French. So there were a lot of French speakers still in Mobile. All the newcomers would have been speaking primarily English. In Pensacola had been a Spanish town, but what they did there is most of the residents of Pensacola had a small enclave around the fort. When it was surrendered, the Spanish government offered them passage to another Spanish colony, to Mexico, if they wanted it. So when the British took over Pensacola, they essentially took over a fort, and there wasn't much of a populated town. So most of the people in Pensacola are speaking English because there's so few Spanish speakers that were left in the town. So the answer is a little convoluted, but yeah, there were multiple languages, but English was the primary language because that's what most of the people who actually occupied it in the 70s, 60s, and 70s spoke.
Mike, during this period, is this when the French Canadians were shipped out of Canada and moved down to Louisiana to become the Cajuns eventually?
Yeah, I don't know the exact year of that, but that's of course in this era. I don't know the Louisiana history well enough to say the exact year, but I think it occurred a little prior to this. While that was right between the end of the French period, the beginning of the Spanish period, of Louisiana. So that this is the same general era, but I can't offhand give you the exact date that occurred.
Hey, Mike, before
Yes.
you leave us, could you tell us just a little bit? I know it's just a short time, but a little bit about Blakely State Park.
Sure. We're Alabama's largest Civil War battlefield. Got 2,000 acres. We're site of one of Alabama's largest cities in 1820. We're on the state seal. We were designed to be a rival port to Mobile. It's a ghost town now. But we've got 25 miles of hiking and biking trails. We interpret all the history from Native American era to colonial period. Baldwin County's first seat, the Civil War battle, do all that here. We also have RV camping, tent camping. We got 4 fully furnished cabins. We got horse trailer camping. We got an event center, do a lot of weddings, do educational programs year round. We've got a boat, passenger pontoon boat. We take something on the order of 20 different cruises throughout the Mobile Tensas Delta all year round. I know offhand what we're scheduling. In April, we got 15 different cruises in 3 different ports. So we're always using that to extend the reach of the park to the entire Mobile Tensas Delta, which a lot of people down here, after a book came out with the title, now conveniently refer to it as America's Amazon. So it's an amazing natural environment with a rich history. And so it's a huge park, but that boat allows the whole Delta to be our park. So that's us in a nutshell.
The boat trips are wonderful. They're very, very good and very well done.
Thank you.
So we could just go to the website if we wanted to.
Go to the website. Yeah, all the upcoming events that we have for the next usually 6 to 8 weeks or somewhere about that. I've got them listed on the site and how to book and be a part of them. We do everything from art sketching, nature sketching, to Civil War tours, to falconry demonstrations. All kinds of stuff's going on year round, and the boats are cruising out of our port and the neighboring facilities port, another state park, and then further up in the Delta. So we're always have something going on year round, but especially spring and fall are our busiest times.
Well, thank you.
What is the website?
BlakelyPark.com, and Blakely is Blakeley. So there are 2 E's. BlakelyPark.com.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Sounds like you've got a lot going on there.
I do. Got construction going on in today, so I need to go tend to that when we're gone with this. Hope that's all going smoothly.
Well, we appreciate you coming today and telling us about our 14th colony.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Be glad to help you guys out anytime. And just been an honor to speak to you, and hope you enjoy your weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mike. Very informative.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.